Have you ever heard of a story so incredible it sounds like it's straight out of a fantasy novel? A story about a teenage girl, a peasant from a tiny village, who ends up leading an entire army and changing the fate of a nation. This isn't a fairy tale. This is the true story of Joan of Arc. Our story begins in the early 15th century, a dark and chaotic time for France. The 100 Years' War against England had been raging for decades, and things were looking bleak. The French were demoralized, their lands were occupied, and their rightful king, the Dauphin Charles, was uncrowned and hiding in fear. It seemed like France was on the brink of complete collapse. But far away from the courts and battlefields, in a small village called Domremy, a young girl named Jeanne d'Arc, or Joan of Arc, as we know her, was growing up. She was just like any other girl of her time, uneducated, devout, and spending her days herding sheep and helping around the house. No one could have imagined she was destined for greatness. Then, when Joan was about 13 years old, something extraordinary happened. She started hearing voices and seeing visions. At first, she was scared and confused, but she came to believe these were divine messages from Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. What was their message? It was a mission of epic proportions. She was to drive the English out of France and see the Dauphin Charles crowned as the rightful king. Can you imagine? A young, illiterate peasant girl being told she had to lead an army and save her country? It sounds impossible, right? Most people would have dismissed it as a dream or a delusion. But Joan's faith was unshakable. For years, she kept these visions to herself. But as the situation in France grew more desperate, the voices became more urgent. When she was 16, Joan knew she had to act. She left her village and sought out the local garrison commander, Robert de Baudricourt, to ask for an escort to see the Dauphin. At first, he laughed her off. I mean, who wouldn't? A teenage girl claiming she was on a mission from God to win a war? He sent her away, telling her family to give her a good spanking. But Joan was persistent. She wasn't the type to give up easily. She returned again and again. Her conviction and passion eventually winning over some of the local soldiers and townspeople. She made a public prediction about a French defeat near Orleans, and when news arrived that her prediction had come true, people started to believe there was something special about her. Finally, Baudricourt relented, gave her a horse and a small escort of soldiers. Before she left, Joan cut her hair short and dressed in men's clothing. This wasn't just a disguise. It was a practical necessity for the dangerous 11-day journey through enemy territory to reach the Dauphin's court at Chinon. This act would later be used against her, but at the time, it was a symbol of her commitment to her mission. When Joan finally arrived at the court, the Dauphin Charles was skeptical, to say the least. To test her, he disguised himself, hiding among his courtiers. But according to the legends, Joan, who had never seen him before, walked straight through the crowd and bowed before him, recognizing him instantly. She then told him things that only he and God could know, private doubts and prayers that convinced him of her divine calling. Still, Charles and his advisors weren't fully convinced. They subjected Joan to weeks of examination by a panel of theologians in Poitiers. They questioned her faith, her background, and the nature of her visions. Joan, despite being uneducated, answered their complex theological questions with a simple, unwavering honesty that left them stumped. They could find no fault in her, concluding that she was a good Christian and her mission might indeed be from God. With the Church's cautious approval, the Dauphin made a decision that would change history. He gave Joan of Arc an army. She was fitted with a suit of white armor and given a banner that she designed herself, depicting Jesus and Mary. At just 17 years old, Joan of Arc, the peasant girl from Domremy, was now a military commander. Her first task was a monumental one: to lift the Siege of Orléans. The city had been under English attack for months and was on the verge of surrender. Its fall would have been a devastating blow to the French cause. The seasoned French commanders were wary of this teenage girl, but the soldiers were inspired by her. Her presence was like a shot of adrenaline to the demoralized army. She wasn't a strategist in the traditional sense, but she was a charismatic and fearless leader. Joan rode at the head of her troops, her banner held high. She didn't fight with a sword, but she was always in the thick of the action, inspiring her men to fight with renewed courage. She told them to stop swearing and to go to church, and they listened. Morale soared. During the battle for Orleans, Joan was wounded by an arrow that pierced her shoulder. The English rejoiced, thinking she was dead or out of action. But Joan pulled the arrow out herself, had the wound dressed, and returned to the front lines, rallying her troops for the final push. Her incredible bravery turned the tide. Within days of her arrival, the French had broken the siege. The English, who had seemed invincible, were in a state of shock and retreated. The victory at Orleans was a massive turning point. It was a miracle. The French started calling Joan the Maid of Orleans. This wasn't just a military victory, it was a huge psychological boost for the entire country. People started to believe that God was on their side, and that they could actually win this war. After Orleans, Joan led the French army in a series of stunning victories along the Loire Valley, clearing the path to Reims. Why Reims? Because Reims Cathedral was the traditional site where French kings were crowned. Joan knew that for Charles to be seen as the legitimate king by all of France, he needed to have his coronation. So, through a combination of swift military action and sheer force of will, Joan escorted the Dauphin through enemy territory to Reims. On July 17, 1429, Charles VII was officially crowned King of France, with Joan of Arc standing beside him at the altar. Her mission, as told to her by her voices, was complete. She had driven back the English and seen her king crowned. You might think this is where the story has its happy ending, but tragically, it's not. After the coronation, Joan wanted to press the advantage and march on Paris, which was still held by the English and their allies. But the royal court was hesitant. King Charles and his advisors preferred diplomacy and negotiation, and Joan's influence began to wane. An attack on Paris failed, and Joan was wounded again. In the spring of 1430, during a minor skirmish, she was captured by Burgundian soldiers who were French allies of the English. King Charles, the man she had put on the throne, made no attempt to rescue her or pay her ransom. He abandoned her. The Burgundians sold her to the English, who were eager to see her discredited and destroyed. The English put Joan on trial for heresy. It wasn't a fair trial. It was a political show trial designed to prove that her victories were the work of the devil, not God, thereby delegitimizing King Charles's crown. For months, she was held in a secular prison, bullied and interrogated by a panel of pro-English church officials led by Bishop Pierre Cauchon. They tried to trap her with complex theological questions. But Joan, alone and without a lawyer, showed incredible courage and intelligence. When they asked if she knew she was in God's grace, a trick question, she famously replied, "If I am not, may God put me there. And if I am, may God so keep me." Her brilliant answers often left her accusers speechless. But in the end, the verdict was a foregone conclusion. They fixated on her refusal to stop wearing men's clothing, which they deemed a crime against God. Under immense pressure and facing death by fire, Joan briefly signed a document renouncing her visions. But she quickly recanted, choosing to be true to her faith and her voices. On May 30th, 1431, at the age of 19, Joan of Arc was taken to the marketplace in Rouen and burned at the stake. As the flames rose, she asked for a cross to be held before her, and her last word was Jesus. Her enemies thought that by burning her, they would erase her from history. They were wrong. Joan's death made her a martyr. Her story inspired the French to fight on with even greater determination. The war continued for another 22 years, but the tide had turned. The French, united and inspired by her memory, eventually drove the English out of France for good, just as she had prophesied. 25 years after her death, a new trial was held, authorized by the very king who had abandoned her. This posthumous retrial investigated the original proceedings, declared them fraudulent, and nullified the verdict. Joan of Arc was officially declared innocent, and nearly 500 years later, in 1920, the Catholic Church canonized her as a saint. The story of Joan of Arc is a powerful reminder that one person, no matter how humble their beginnings, can change the world. She was a teenager who faced down armies and kings, a symbol of courage, faith, and patriotism. Her legacy endures, not just as a historical figure, but as an inspiration for anyone who dares to believe in the impossible. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, please hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible stories from history. See you next time.